You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Malfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. I am your host, Ray Gerard. With me in studio again, the always wise, the always thoughtful Mr. Bob Hennekeys.
Always might be a stretch. Periodic would be a better word, but I like that. Thank you.
Well, I'm feeling in a very kind mood today. Anyways, this is the program that asks, hey, what if St. Paul was alive today and he could look at what was going on in our country and write a letter to us? He wrote a lot of letters. Would he have anything to tell us in America? Is there anything going wrong that he might be able to give us some advice on? Well, if that thought had ever occurred to you, what would somebody from the past like St. Paul have to say? You came to the right place, because we're going to tell you exactly what he said. And there's a reason why we can do that. It's not because we're always wise and intelligent, but it's because St. Paul spoke the truth, and truths don't change. So what are we going to talk about today? Because we always look at some incident, some event that's happening in our culture, and we apply one of St. Paul's truths and ask, are we measuring up? Are we following, what he would say we should do, or are we doing something different? And if we're doing something different, which is right, St. Paul, or the way we're doing it. So that's what we're about here on this program. And so today, what we're going to be talking about, what is that thing that's going on in our culture that we're going to talk about? Well, it's this. We have left Afghanistan in very hurried fashion. We had been there for some 20 years after September 11th, and as we record this program, it is September 11th, 2021. It is the 20th anniversary of that fateful day in New York City and in our nation's capital, some 20 years ago, when more than 3,000 people lost their lives in horrific unexpected fashion. They were just going about their business on a normal day, and somebody, and it wasn't God, decided that they needed to die. And that's what they made happen. And so for 20 years after that, we've been in Afghanistan because it had been a hotbed of terrorism where terrorists had organized, had trained, and had prepared to carry out missions. And so we went there to try to take the fight over there instead of having the fight over here. Well, we recently decided it was time for us to leave, and we left, as I say, in very hurried fashion. But there's a question that has been raised by all of this, the way it all unfolded, and that is, what about the people that are still in Afghanistan? Are they facing certain consequences now that they should not have? Did we leave people behind? And if we did, if we ended up leaving faster than we had to, and people Now we're going to experience consequences as a result of it. Well, then the question is, well, why? And the title of this program, the title of our program today is Bury My Heart. And where does that come from? Well, there was a book I remember, came out when I was young, but it was very popular at the time. And it was called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it was written by a guy who wanted to tell the story of American Indians and what they suffered at the hands of Americans. And the title of the book came from a poem. Now, the poem was not about American Indians, not quite so much. But it was about a guy who, in the early 20th century, said, I'm tired. It was called American Names. Stephen Vincent Benet wrote this poem. It's called American Names. And it was like, don't talk to me about, these names of these places in France, names of these places in England. Europe, of course, was, the place. I mean, it had colonized a large section of the globe, and it was the sophisticated, all of the sophisticated places in the world. They were in Europe, and when you were in America, we were known for our pioneering folks, our backwards kind of ways. But Mr. Benet had a different view. He said, "Look, talk to me about Medicine Hat. Talk to me about Tucson. Talk to me about Deadwood, French Lick, Skunktown Plain. Those are the names that I want to talk about. Don't tell me about Montparnasse or Winchelsea or Sussex. No, talk to me about these American places." He was proud of America. Anyways, he said, you can bury my body in England. You can bury my tongue in France. He said, but the last two lines of the poem, I shall not be there. I shall rise and pass. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Now, because he mentioned the names of this poem, Medicine Hat, Deadwood, places like that, he was familiar or an aficionado or perhaps, somebody who appreciated the American West. And so a place like Wounded Knee was well known to him. It was the site of a massacre. The last time that, the U.S. Army waged an attack on Native Americans, the site of the last major attack by the U.S. Army on Native Americans, it occurred in 1890. And it was a slaughter. American Indians, were senselessly, horrifically slaughtered. They were killed. It was a killing field. So he wrote, bury my heart. You can bury my heart there. Because I am, as if he was saying what? I am there with them. I sympathize with them. Whatever. I died a little bit, with them. I mean, he really, absorbed the tragedy that those people felt. I suppose there's another way of kind of looking at that line or interpreting that line. I mean, bury my heart. My heart's killed. My heart's dead. I'm lost to feeling. After something like that happens, I can't feel anymore. There's no love left. I just, can't try to, care for people. Is that something that we could use in describing either what caused or how we're reacting to our exit from Afghanistan? Why is Afghanistan to be put on a par with Wounded Knee? We'll tell you. But first, how about a letter from St. Paul? How about remembering when St. Paul wrote, "For Christ, while we were still helpless, yet died at the appointed time for the ungodly. Indeed, only with difficulty does one die for a just person, though perhaps for a good person one might even find courage to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." What's it about? It's about someone making the ultimate sacrifice for people who didn't deserve it. There are victims in Afghanistan. They did nothing wrong. In the context of this story, they're not even sinners. They're just the innocents. God has such love that even for the people who aren't innocent, even for the people who have rejected him, even the people who have done him wrong, he will still, and did still, and continues to still, make the ultimate sacrifice for them. But if we left people behind that we should not have, if we turned our back on people that took a great risk for us, they were the ones who were endangering themselves with the ultimate sacrifice. I mean, a lot of these people helped us over these past 20 years. They aided the Americans. They hated Americans. They put their own lives in danger. Far from being sinners, these were people that were, in effect, in a way, they're putting themselves on the line for the ultimate sacrifice. They were showing great courage. They were extending great love. Instead of rejecting us, they were showing great love for us. Maybe they had their own self-interest, but still the same. And if we turned our back on them, then we're not only failing to show the same love that God has, we're doing the opposite. We're doing the opposite. Would St. Paul tell us today in America, you're doing the opposite? Because remember now, or notice, what's the point? What's the focal point of this passage? God proves his love for us. That's the message St. Paul wants to tell us. He died, when we were separated from him by our own choosing, and he proved his love for us. That's what St. Paul wants to tell us. God loves you with such an immense passion that no matter what you do, he will still love you. You may end up being punished in a way of your making, but he will never stop loving you. It's all about the love. It's all about the love. It's whether you have a heart. It's whether we feel for those people. I mean, isn't that what we strive for? That we should be a compassionate society, that we shouldn't discriminate against anybody, that even the people that we look upon as the lowest, those are the people that we should elevate the highest. Those are the people that we should love the most. It should be love for everybody. And that's what the message St. Paul says. God has love for everybody, even the people that rejected him. And that's what he would want to tell us to do. You have to love everybody.
Even on the cross, as he was dying, he forgave the people that were crucifying him. So he was ridiculously loving to a point where even those that were causing him the pain, the anguish, and the death, he was forgiving them. Just an amazing thing. I don't think I would be near as good or near as capable of forgiving someone who was unjustly putting me to death. That would not be my feeling as I was struggling. Yet Christ did exactly that. Just did exactly that.
This is one of those times that proves St. Paul, because if we took that question that we started the program with, hey, if we're not doing what St. Paul said, and we're doing something different, who's right? Well, let's ask this question: should we not love everyone all the time? Is not that the ultimate? Is there something that would be better than that? I mean, if we have that, you're talking about heaven on earth. So let's put it this way: you could not even believe in God at all. You could certainly not want to listen to the writings of St. Paul. You might not buy into the Catholic thing. You might not buy any of that. But if you agree with the idea that love is the way that human beings should act towards one another, then guess what? You do agree with St. Paul. And, this is one of those times where the nature of who we are, just human experience, proves that what St. Paul is saying, is consistent with what we all agree is good. And so if we're agreed on all of that, then if we're not acting in that fashion, maybe something's wrong. Well, perhaps we're not acting in that fashion. David Axelrod, who worked with Mr. Obama, President Obama, while he was vice president in the Obama administration. David Gerard, someone who has defended Obama and Biden on many occasions, said, however, you cannot defend the execution here. This has been a disaster, and anybody with a beating heart, watching these scenes of people desperately swarming the airport, trying to get out ahead of the slaughter that they anticipate from the Taliban, you know, it is heartbreaking. Anyone with a beating heart has to feel for this. If you've forgotten or if you haven't been paying attention to the news, there were people that were running with airplanes as they were taxiing down a runway. Why in the world would you do that? What could you possibly hope to gain? Obviously they are so emotionally distraught. They're actually chasing airplanes on foot, and some of them clung to the airplanes until they fell. You talk about the sheer desperation, the abject, completely consuming fear that these people must feel at the approaching, rule of the Taliban, that they're willing to do this. Well, then let's ask a question. If they are so fearful, and if we're supposed to love everybody else, are we supposed to feel what they feel? If we don't, do we have a heart? David Axelrod said, anybody with a beating heart. So, if that's true, were there no alternatives? Could we not have done anything different? Oh, of course we could have. They could have done so much different. These people did not have to suffer. So he said, you can't defend the execution here. He's not a Republican. He's not an opponent. This is one, and this is not, and he's not alone in this. There are lots of people who are saying the same thing.
Ray, I traveled around a lot in my previous job. And one of the things I do is I would go into other countries. And I would go into other countries where the United States was and sanctioned and would be there, trusting that they would take care of me. Not trusting other governments, but trusting that the United States would take care of me. So I went to a place like China. Even with all that China is, the United States has a presence there. I was taken care of there. And I remember somebody asking me to go with them to North Korea. And I said, not a chance. And they said, why? And I said, well, the United States the State Department doesn't write that you can go to North Korea. In fact, it says stay the heck out. This is not a safe place. And so I would look to see whether I, as an American citizen, would be protected, and there were systems in place to protect me in the places I would visit and go do business in. These folks felt that they were protected in Afghanistan, felt as if the United States was going to protect them, had a duty to do so, and then they were completely abandoned. I can only imagine the fear, the aggravation, all the range of things that was going on in these folks' minds to feel completely abandoned and without hope that would then cause somebody to leap onto a moving plane and without much of a chance for survival at all still try to do that. It just had to be raw emotions, just absolute fear.
So we're told by the White House, the administration, that they're working with the Taliban. The Taliban's operating in a recent release. So they're working with the Taliban. Taliban is operating in a business-like fashion. We're going to they're going to let the Americans out, and they're not going to prevent us and so forth. Now, the Taliban was the group that was in power in Afghanistan on 9/11 when the towers got struck. They were the ones that we ousted when we went into Afghanistan. They were a terrorist organization. So we're told now that perhaps they've changed somewhat. There's a TV station down in Dallas, and they did an interview with a local guy. And he was chairman of the board of directors for the Islamic Association of North Texas. And he said, now this is about a week before the final pullout. This is August 22nd. He said, I've been on the phone night and day with people in Kabul. This man's name is Aziz Boudry. He said, everybody is asking me for help. How can they get out of the country? A nightmare. I think I'm dreaming, he said. He goes on. 3 days ago, somebody from Arlington, Texas calls me, an Afghan immigrant. He said his brother, who had SIV, a special immigrant visa, was on his way to the airport, the Kabul airport. The Taliban put 5 bullets in him. There was one family who said, I'd rather die. Then we're going to go to the airport. I'd rather die here than go to the airport because I know the Taliban are going to kill me anyway. This is what's going on over there. And there's more stories, more stories like this. There's an 8th grader. There are 24 California students who are left behind. There's a superintendent of a school in the Sacramento area, and they had some students over there. I'm not sure of how that occurred, but anyways, he said one of our 8th graders said it was chaos. Apparently they were doing maybe some kind of a Zoom call or video call. He said you could see it in his eyes, anxiety and fear. That was on September 1st. This article was written September 1st. So it seems like this boy, this 8th grader, and that's the point of the story. This 8th grader and 24 California students left behind, living in fear. There's another man wrote an article in a Tampa Bay newspaper, and he grew up in Kabul. He immigrated here to the United States, but he said, he remembers the harsh cruelty that I knew growing up in Kabul during the Taliban regime. And he talks about the fact how the new government that has been announced by the Taliban, he said, quote, further breaks my heart for millions of Afghans back home. There's one of these guys, Sarayuddin Haqqani, who's been responsible for some of the most gut-wrenching, attacks in Kabul, innocent children, men, women. He's now the Minister of the Interior. He's got a $5 million bounty on his head as a terrorist. Ministry of the Interior. So he's going to be responsible for taking care of things and working in a business-like fashion. And he talks about this fellow just talks about dashed dreams. This guy, Azizi, he lives down in St. Petersburg, apparently. He's a real estate broker. He said the American University says the dream of many Afghan students and produced outstanding Fulbright scholars. Now the buildings are empty, and many of its students pleaded to be evacuated, but were abandoned. So, you've got loss of life, and besides just loss of life, the loss of real physical life, but also the loss of, I guess, a rewarding life, the loss of hope for a life you could enjoy, dreams shattered. I mean, this is what these people are hearing from the people they know back over there. So, this isn't new, though. We knew of this. Why couldn't we have done it different? Well, we could have. There was a guy who wrote an article. I've got, sometimes I can't find things as quickly as I want to, but here it is. There's a gentleman, what's his name? I don't know his name. I guess it doesn't matter what his name is. Kash Patel, that's his name. And he was named Chief of Staff at the Pentagon, where one of his primary responsibilities was to wind down the war in Afghanistan. And he said that the president at the time, President Trump, instructed me to do a methodical exit plan. Some of the requirements were that both sides had to repudiate al-Qaeda. There was going to be an interim joint government. These sides had to agree, and we would leave a small special operations force against any terrorist activity. They had multiple rounds of negotiations after this plan was put into effect about a year and a half ago. Multiple rounds of negotiations between the Taliban and the President Ashraf Ghani. U.S. forces were drawn down to about 2,500. And then when the new administration came in, they announced that there would be a withdrawal. They announced the definite date for the withdrawal, and they imposed no conditions on the withdrawal. So people knew that this was going to happen. It could have been done different. You could have maintained those conditions where, unless there was an interim government, we'd just simply keep staying. You just push back the date. You could have, and why would you want to do that? I mean, wouldn't you, if you felt something in your heart for the people there, wouldn't you do that? The whole idea of the joint government, the interim government, was that there'd be stability so that people wouldn't have to face what they're facing now. Do you care about people? This is, we started with this. We started with a reading from St. Paul that talked about Christ's sacrifice, and it was based in love. And that forms, and everything revolves around the cross. Everything in the Catholic faith, everything in the Christian world revolves around the cross. Why? Because it's the ultimate sacrifice. It's the ultimate example. And what is it an ultimate example of? It's an ultimate example of a certain kind of love, not the romantic, passionate, man-woman kind, but of a different kind of love where, you care for the person, son, daughter, father, mother, friend, colleague, stranger on the street, whatever, where you consider them first. You put them first. Before anything you want to do, before your own wants, your own desires, you put them first. That's the Christian model. The United States for years has stood as the example of that. We stood for helping other countries obtain freedom. We didn't always do it perfectly. We didn't do it without problems. But that's what we stood for. That was the moral claim that we could make. Maybe we couldn't claim that we executed it as well as we might want to at times. But that was the claim. That was the reason for the Marshall Plan. We defeated Germany in the Second World War. The Russians took half of Germany and they subjugated it. We took half of Germany and gave them money and helped them get back on their feet and then left. We defeated Japan in the Second World War. We helped them and then left. We didn't conquer them as a territory and keep them. We could make this claim that we were trying to help other people enjoy the same kind of life that we were able to enjoy here. We cared for other people. That's what we stood for, to help other people. If this was just about us, to get us out, because we don't want to be in this war anymore, and we're going to do it so quick, we just want to bug out, and we don't care who we leave behind, we're a different country. And so the question is, what kind of a country are we becoming, and do we want to be that country? Do we want to be a country where love isn't the center of who we are, or who we at least think we are? Meghan McCain was an anti-Trump advocate, a Biden supporter. Father was Senator John McCain, a Republican, but somebody who considered Biden a colleague and a friend for decades in the Senate of the U.S. And Biden was a personal friend. She said when on August, after the president's speech, the president gave a speech on August 31st, and after that, Meghan McCain wrote, I do not recognize this man. She said 13 American soldiers are dead, most of them between the ages of 20 to 23. Yeah, there were 13 American soldiers who died trying to guard the airport in Kabul as we're affecting this evacuation from the airport.
Suicide attack, if I remember right.
It was a suicide attack. And she said they're dead, most of them between the ages of 20 and 23, because they were put in harm's way chaotically in the line of fire of a suicide bomber. And that's true. I mean, these people, they would let them through the gate, they'd search them. Well, what if you're searching somebody who's got a bomb on it? You're going to die. And that's what happened to 13 people. This is extremely difficult for me to say, she continues. I once thought I truly knew Joe Biden, and he helped me through pain and grief, for which I am grateful. Maybe he helped her when her father died. I don't know. This man on TV giving this speech, I do not recognize this man. God help our country. God help the Americans we have abandoned. She is feeling in her heart for the suffering that the Americans left behind are going to be going through.
Well, there's their suffering. There's anyone that they're related to. There is just a phenomenal amount of pain being set up all the way across, right? There's the people in Afghanistan, and there's everyone that loved them. Since we live here in St. Louis, we had one of our folks come back home, and his body came back home. And the love and the outpouring for him over in Wentzville was just tremendous because of the love that they had for him. It's just incredible to me that we could do this sort of thing, allow this sort of thing to happen, and not protect those that, my goodness, we had promised to protect.
Are we on the right track, do you think, where I'm saying, Meghan McCain is feeling, dramatically in her heart for these people? Is it right to think that the president doesn't feel the same way? I'm sure he does. I'm sure he cares about these people. Anyways, this speech on August 31st that Meghan McCain was reacting to, in it the president said, since March, we reached out 19 times to Americans in Afghanistan with multiple warnings and offers to help them leave Afghanistan. Of course, all the way as far back as March. Now, of course, back in March, this reality of, the troops leaving as quickly as they did, it was still, it was not a certainty. As recently as like a week or so, I think before, there was an interview with George Stephanopoulos that the president said, well, we'll stay after August 31st if we have to. And so anyways, but then the president continues, after we started the evacuation 17 days ago, we did so this is August 31st, after we started the evacuation 17 days ago, we did initial outreach and analysis and identified around 5,000 Americans who had earlier decided to stay but now wanted to leave. What does that mean? I remember when I heard him say that, it occurred to me that, there's only one reason for saying that. It's to partially blame them, right? It's not our fault. It's their fault. They wanted to, we had warned them, and they wanted to stay, but now they want to leave. They changed their mind. They changed their mind, and now they want to leave. Well, we'll try to help them as best we can, but, really, these people that are dying, they're partially to blame. The President of the United States, he is supposed to be the one who comes in times of trouble, times of trauma. He stands up and, people look to the president for moral leadership, for, calmness in the storm, for the person to guide the rest of us. And is that the way we're supposed to also, if we're supposed to be guided by this, are we supposed to think, well, it's their fault? What? So if they die, it's their fault? There's a thing about blaming the victim. And people decry it as a heartless thing. That it's the worst thing you can do. Well, it sounds an awful lot like blaming the victim. Would you say that if you had a heart? If you really, to have a heart, it means to really feel for these people to the extent that you should. Again, perhaps we're being too harsh. Maybe we're being too harsh. So it might be worth noting that another president, Gerald Ford, wrote in his biography about Joseph Biden. And now Gerald Ford was the president from just a short period of time Was it 1973 to 1976? 74. That's right. That's
he
right.
resigned in 74.
74 to
76 was the election.
76.
77,
Right.
Carter took over.
So, anyways, he wrote about an episode where he was in the White House, and Joe Biden at the time was a freshman senator, and there was a committee from the Senate that had come over to the White House to discuss the withdrawal from Vietnam. And in his biography, President Ford specifically mentions Mr. Biden, who was still only a freshman senator, at the time. And in his memoirs, he wrote that Biden said, "I will vote for any amount of money for getting the Americans out, but I don't want it mixed with getting the Vietnamese out." Are we not supposed to love everybody? The president, Mr. Ford, responded, "Gentlemen, I respect your views, but I have to carry out the plan that, in my opinion, is in our nation's best interest. If we try to pull out right now, it'll lead to panic and chaos and will jeopardize the lives of untold Americans. Believe me, we need to buy time, even a few days." The Democrats refused. 4 days later, President Thieu resigned, fled the country, just like President Ghani in Afghanistan. And we have now the famous videos of helicopters lifting off from the embassy in Afghanistan, in Saigon. And of course, when President Biden was asked before our evacuation whether or not we were going to see a similar, we were going to see similar images on our TV, he said absolutely not. And yet we saw not only the same images but worse, people falling from flying aircraft. But notice, President Ford said that he thought a delay to, staying longer, to try to stabilize the situation, keeping the troops there longer, was in our nation's best interest. Because if we try to pull out now, it'll lead to panic and chaos and will jeopardize lives. It was in our nation's best interest. If we pulled out quickly and it led to chaos and it jeopardized lots of lives, some of that's bad for our nation's interest. Why is that? All the people, every American citizen is in our nation's, protecting each American citizen is in our nation's interest. Our Bill of Rights centered around the idea that one person is as important as the entire federal government. It's the rights of one person can be held up in a court of law to defeat the entire government of the United States of America when the government is acting in an unconstitutional fashion, when it tries to override protected individual rights. This is our nation's interest to care for people. That was the view then by a president. If we're going to continue to examine this, let's see. There was a Democratic caucus in early 1975. And Mr. Biden at this caucus said, "I may be the most immoral son of a gun in this room," as he argued against aid to Cambodia, spending money for people in Cambodia. Anyways, he said, quote, "I'm getting sick and tired of hearing about morality or moral obligation." And then in 2010, according to the diary of Richard Holbrooke, who was President Barack Obama's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, according to Mr. Holbrooke's diary, when Biden was asked, then Vice President Biden was asked about American obligations to Afghanistan, like a girl in a Kabul school, Biden replied, "F that. We don't have to worry about that." A little girl in a Kabul school, an 8th grade, possibly Afghani girl who had apparently been in the U.S. and had been at a Sacramento school and was back in Afghanistan for some reason. A little 8th grade girl from Sacramento, or some little girl in a school in Vietnam, or just the moral obligation that we owe to people. Don't have to worry about that. It's about, the question, I guess, is really about caring for people. And how much do we care or not care for people? And shouldn't that be part of our national policy? If as a country, if as a nation, we lose sight of caring for people, what's the point?
Well, in fact, we quite often accuse other countries of being wrong for doing exactly that, for going in and killing others, for genocide, for various reasons. We think that's horrible. We call it horrific. And it is, right? To trade off these lives, to not do what's needed to protect these folks. And in fact, the other way, to allow them to die or actually to kill them, we think is horrific, and we should think it's horrific. Here, we're saying they're just part of the sacrifice. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Oh, isn't that too bad? It's their own fault. Let's go ahead and let them die. Let's sacrifice them in order to pull off the plan that we want. Seems like crazy thinking.
Well, it's just, would that thinking have been there? It would have been the same if we cared more for the people. I mean, isn't that what this is all about? It's about loving and caring people. That's the issue in the smallest of problems that we'll encounter from day to day. And it's true for the biggest problems of entire countries. It's the same because truths apply in all places and all times, but they also apply in all circumstances. They apply in small circumstances and they apply in big circumstances. And that's why, when St. Paul says, hey, the example of Christ in sacrificing for people that he shouldn't have, that he had no obligation to care about. He had no moral obligation to care about, and still he cared. And that's the example. And here there's people that have helped us or that are part of us. They're American citizens. And we don't need to feel a moral obligation for them? Of course you do. Of course we all do. We have a moral obligation, to take care of everybody that we can. It's just, that's why people like Meghan McCain are distraught.
They're sickened.
They're sickened. Now, if that isn't bad enough, what happens if you have a national policy that doesn't have that as its center? Well, then you're not if you violate that principle, if you cause people untold suffering, there are reports they're going house to house, hunting people down. It's been reported from multiple sources that, for example, there were planes. After the U.S. got out, private contractors, private organizations started to try to help get people out. And there were 6 planes that right there, I think on September 1st or right after the pullout, they had 6 planes loaded. The people were loaded onto the planes. They never took off. The people eventually had to get off those planes, and they're supposedly living in safe houses, so-called. But the Taliban is going door to door looking for them. And how do they know who to look for? Well, the reason those planes didn't take off is because they needed permission from the U.S. And so these private organizations had to turn over manifests to the State Department listing all the people on those planes. Well, the U.S. handed those manifests to the Taliban.
Why?
We gave them the identity of these people. It's like having a police undercover agent who goes he's inside the mafia. And then you tell the mafia who he is. You betray that person. And then, of course, the mafia will turn around and kill that person. That's what the U.S., because we're trusting the Taliban is going to be good and kind and so on. But they just appointed a guy as their Minister of the Interior who is responsible for many terrorist killings of innocent people. It's really hard to comprehend, and it's really hard to try to defend what's going on. You have outed these people. You've doxed these people. And you've doxed them to people who kill without compassion, kill without reservation. That's who you've doxed them to. You haven't just doxed them to the point where they're going to suffer public ridicule. You've doxed them to the point where they're going to die. And that was our State Department.
Can you help me explain why we told them not to take off? Why would we stop them from taking off? Were we afraid that they were harboring somebody that we didn't like and we didn't want to deal with that?
The private organizations claim that these people have already passed through the U.S. vetting process. There's an organization called OFAC, O-F-A-C, I believe is the spelling. And the people that were allowed on the planes all passed that initial test. And secondly, they're not flying to the U.S. They would fly to some other place, and then they would be offloaded, and then you could continue to do as much background checking as you would want on those people before you might eventually let them into the U.S., maybe not. But there'd be time to do that. Now they're off those planes in Afghanistan, hiding for their lives, and presumably to get permission for any of them to leave, we have to get permission, and we have to, get the agreement of the Taliban. So effectively, they're hostages. There are reports of hundreds of these people, close to 1,000 from these planes. Back when Iran became a big thing on the worldwide stage, when Jimmy Carter was president, we had 53 American hostages held for about a little over a year, I think. Now there could be at least over 1,000. Hundreds of them American, some of them, SIV, special immigrant visa holders who have helped the U.S. A lot of them are journalists, people that have worked for Voice of America, which is an American organization. It's a branch of our federal government. A lot of them worked for another, or as a private organization, but funded, I believe, by the U.S. But American journalists, left there by the hundreds. There were urgent pleas to the White House days before the evacuation. Please, we've got to do what we need to do to get these people out, left behind. And journalists who reported, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. The other organization was Radio Free Europe. That's part of its name. But they're not appreciated by the Taliban. The journalists regularly got death threats. Some of them have been killed already. Well, since from 2016, I think 4 of the people from this organization were killed. And to leave them behind. I mean, why would we not let them out? Would you have to admit you were wrong, right? Would you have to admit that we evacuated people? If these private organizations are going around after August, we leave on August 31st. And if these private organizations are then continuing to do what we couldn't do, isn't that a slap in your face? So you, refuse to let these planes, go. I mean, is it just is it all about you and making you look good? The president, according to Reuters, had a phone call. President Biden had a phone call with the president of Afghanistan, who's now fled the country. His name was Mr. Ghani. Reuters obtained a transcript of that call. Call began, and then almost immediately President Biden said, there's a perception around so right away, right after the phone call starts, a perception around in parts of the world that things are not going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban. This is in July, like late July, so about 6 weeks perhaps, July 23rd, so 5 weeks before the August 31st pullout. There's a perception that things aren't going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban. And there's a need, whether it's true or not, there's a need to project a different picture. So it's all about the picture that we present. He said that basically he made comments about getting more help if you adopt this strategy, which will try to help change this perception. President Ghani responds, Mr. President. I mean, so he's asking him, President Biden's asking him to adopt some policies which will change the perception. President Ghani was dealing with different concerns. He said, Mr. President, we are facing a full-scale invasion composed of Taliban, full Pakistani planning and logistical support, and at least 10 to 15,000 international terrorists. Second, what is crucial is close air support. What we need at this moment is air power. If you could assign your national security advisor or the Pentagon or anyone you wish to work with us on the details, so our expectation, particularly regarding your close air support, et cetera, et cetera. He said, he said, I just spoke with one of his ministers, and he said he went to negotiate with the Taliban. The Taliban showed no inclination. We can get to peace if we rebalance the military situation. We will be able to rally, but your assurance of support is going to be the key. He was pleading. He was facing, here he is, a president in his home country. He's facing a full military invasion, outside interference from the Pakistanis, 10 to 15,000 terrorists. He was pleading for the life of his country. Give us some close air support. If we can rebalance the military situation, we can rally. We can get our people to believe that, and it wouldn't happen. Senator Ben Sass, then there's reports that all of a sudden this is becoming an old story. People don't want to talk about Afghanistan anymore, and certainly the news organizations are not covering it. As a matter of fact, the major networks didn't cover that telephone call at all. Senator from Nebraska, Mr. Ben Sass, said, President Biden desperately wants to talk about anything but Afghanistan. But Americans who are hiding from the Taliban, ISIS, and the Haqqani network don't give a damn about news cycles, long weekends, and polling. They want out. The Biden administration has a moral obligation. There are those words, moral obligation, again. So if the journalists aren't covering these stories, there's another article I can refer to where it shows that the Post, the Washington Post, New York Times, and so forth, organizations that had spent a lot of time complaining or criticizing the way we engaged in this after August 31st are no longer reporting on this. So people are suffering there. They're living, we're out. They're living in the situation that's left behind. They've got people going door to door, hunting them down. They're suffering, and for us, it's an old news story. So this is not just about the president. This is about the country. Do we not care? I'm old enough that I remember a country when this would not be tolerated. Not this way. Not this way. Vietnam was a different story. Here, we had the upper hand. We had all the power. We left because we felt like it. In Vietnam, we were losing that war. Here, we had control of the country, and we simply no longer wanted it. And we threw these people under the bus because we just simply decided. As a news story, people don't want to talk about it anymore. It's too uncomfortable to talk about. It's old news. Where is the heart? I'll tell you what. Bury my heart in Afghanistan.
Ray, if you just put together a cohesive plan to allow these people to leave and defend them long enough until we can get folks out, the rush that we had to do this, like we had to do it by a certain date, some date was intrinsic, some mark on a calendar, why we could not hold control and keep them protected until we could get the folks out. I don't understand that. Would that make it go too long? Would we therefore lose face somehow and allow all these people to die, to be persecuted the way they are? Do we not love our fellow man that we would allow this to occur? Seems crazy.
Well, perhaps we could use a prayer for as a nation for us to feel some more heart. So,
let's pray in the name of the Father and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, let us truly understand human life, the value of human life, whether it be an aborted fetus, whether it be someone on death row, and in this case, the lives of Americans and Afghanis that are left behind. Allow us not to count people like they're sheep or dollars. Allow us to have our hearts open to those. Jesus went way beyond what we could do, and he began to love and desired us to love those that were fighting against him, that were sinners, that were doing the wrong things. Allow us not to be so harsh. Allow us to love one another, to protect their lives, take care of them and love them and watch over them. Let us be a country that takes care of the underdog, that watches over those in need and tries to help all of those around the world that need that help from terrorism and brutality. Allow us to love and to follow your Son's example, not only as loving those around him, but then to pay the ultimate price of death on a cross to save us. Allow us to be just a little bit more like him. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.